Okay, good afternoon and welcome to the Bermuda Economic Development Corporation Cybersecurity webinar series. And today's topic is your online payment platform secure? My name is Ronnie Vieira. I'm Chief Operating Officer at First Atlantic Commerce. And I have with me my colleague, Tricia Lyons-Hill, who's a Senior Vice President of Marketing Development at First Atlantic Commerce.
Good afternoon, everybody.
Once again, thanks for joining us today. So just to get some administrative work out the way, anything we say today is that the opinions of Tricia and I solely, not necessarily associated with First Atlantic Commerce. And then just a little bit about us. So I've been in IT and cybersecurity for over 40 years. Just a little indication of my age. And I've been with FAC and payments for over 20 years as well. Tricia has been in marketing and business development for over 30 years, and she also has been in FAC and payments for 20 years. So hopefully we can give you the benefit of our knowledge today during the session. So the agenda today, I'm going to touch a little bit on cybersecurity, which will refer to some information I presented in November at a cybersecurity webinar at that time. And then we'll talk about securing your web store. And I've sort of categorized the security of web store into three areas: site administration, the personal and other data that your store is holding, and then the payment process. And then we'll finish off with how to start the online store process, which Tricia will be able to help out. And then, of course, we'll have questions, and we welcome any questions that you have today. So in terms of cybersecurity, as I mentioned in November, for those of you able to attend, cybersecurity is defined as the people, processes, and technology used to protect systems and data from unauthorized access, use, disclosure, modification, disruption, removal, and destruction. So it's a bit of a mouthful, admittedly, but that's sort of what it encompasses, and all the access controls and security controls around your systems are designed to do exactly that. There's also something in the cybersecurity world, profession called the cybersecurity triad. It addresses the issue of confidentiality. So you want to be sure the data is accessed and viewed by authorized persons only. You also want to make sure that the data has integrity. That is, that it is accurate and is up to date. And then the third thing is that the system and data are available when they are needed. So on one slide sort of encapsulates the objectives of cybersecurity. And that sort of forms a good basis for the presentation today. So in terms of your web store, for many, those that are only have a web store and don't have a physical premise, the web store front end, or the image of your business, is the image of your business. So that your website design, what it looks like, is all affects the reputation of your business. And you want to make sure that you protect sort of that. We're going to talk about that in a minute. And then typically, many small to medium-sized businesses will use a cloud-based service for hosting your web store. So some larger businesses and some medium-sized businesses will build it themselves, and that's fine too. The security that we're going to talk about today still applies. However, many will use a cloud-based service, as I mentioned. And so it's important to evaluate the vendor and the capabilities of the software before you select it, one to go with in terms of using it for your live store. And then any application, whether it be a hosted solution or an in-house on-premise solution, is going to hold data. And that data is going to typically be product data, customer data, and financial data, all of which you want to make sure is secured properly. As any security event or any sort of data loss will cause disruption to your business and could possibly have a financial impact. So in terms of site administration, you're going to typically need an administrator level access in your site. So the administrator level access provides for designing the site, what the graphics are, how the website flows, and the rules that you would build into the website and your store. It would also involve setting up the inventory. So, setting it up initially and then maintaining it. That will, of course, include sort of costing information, the pricing of that inventory, and it probably will include other financial data. And then it would also provide a facility for setting users up. That is, let's say staff that work for your company that you also need to work on the site in the background, or the customer service or whatever. It'll provide a facility for setting those users up. So all of these functions are something that an administrator would do in your site. It should be considered a privileged access user ID, and these functions should be restricted to sort of as fewer people as possible, particularly sort of a manager. So when you're considering user access controls, and this would include the administrator level access control, you will make sure that there's proper user authentication. So you want to be sure that everybody has unique user IDs, nobody's using a generic user ID, and that they're using complex passwords. So by complex passwords, I'm referring to consisting of special characters or alphanumeric characters, upper, lowercase, etc. A minimum length of 12 characters, although the longer the password, the better, the more secure. You want to be sure that the password expires every 90 days or thereabouts, so that the user is forced to change the password on a regular basis. And then you want to try to prevent repeated passwords. So you don't want people using passwords, that they used sort of the last time. And usually a web store or some sort of shopping application will allow you to do this. And then very importantly, you want to use two-factor authentication. So this is where when you try to log into your web store, it will send a text message to your phone with some sort of access code. That is a very useful feature for mitigating any user compromise. So it's something to really look out for when you're looking for a software provider or looking to implement as part of your process. And then also, in terms of users, you want to be sure that you set the authorization levels up properly. So I mentioned on my previous slide that the administrator is going to have access to various aspects of the site. You don't want your average staff member to be able to change your website configuration. So you want to be sure that that is only allowed for the administrator. So typically you want to make sure that user access and the authorization levels of a user are configured so that they have the minimum necessary for the role that they're performing. And then continuing on the site administration, the other effective tool to use for users and mitigating any cybersecurity event is security awareness training. There are plenty of training videos online on YouTube or wherever for providing this level of training. It really is essential for users to understand what are the things to look for when an email comes in, and what makes an email look suspicious. Doing security awareness training will help them understand where the risks are and when they should ask for help, or when they should just delete the email, quite frankly. And it's a very effective tool for preventing ransomware attacks. Ransomware is a very prevalent attack method that cyber actors are using, and it is very effective if the users are not trained properly. And it doesn't require much. It requires a user to click on an attachment which contains malware, or click on a link which takes them to a site which infects the local machine. And then what typically happens is they'll encrypt all the data on your machine and ask for a ransom payment, typically in Bitcoin. So once you provide the Bitcoin payment, they will provide the decryption keys, and you can typically decrypt the data. However, having said that, it doesn't always work. Obviously, some of them are pure criminals. They'll take the Bitcoin and basically don't provide the keys. However, it's becoming more of a business, and they make a lot of money at it. So just like any business, they wouldn't make any money if they didn't provide the keys. So they typically do provide the keys. Anyway, without going down that rabbit hole, the main thing here is you want to prevent this. And security awareness training is a very effective way for doing so. The other control that you want to have is taking your own backup. So if you're using a service provider for your shopping cart or your web store, they will probably do backups. However, you want to make sure you take control of that yourself. Typically, they'll allow you to download all of the data in the site. And if they do, you should do that on a regular basis. And this is just so that you have a sort of ultimate resource for recovery if there is some sort of cyber event on your site. Obviously, you want to rely on the provider, service provider in this case, to recover your site. But in the event that they can't, or there's some other issue, at least you have all of the data yourself, and you've downloaded it and you have backed up. You also want to avoid storing any backup data on your own servers or workstation. Difficult, I understand. However, if you are infected by a ransomware attack, as I mentioned earlier, typically they will encrypt everything on your server or everything on your workstation. You don't want your backup data to be caught up in that encryption process. So backups are really critical. So I mentioned something in November, just a concept called the crown jewels. And the idea of the crown jewels is when it comes to cybersecurity and implementing security controls, you want to identify what is it that you're trying to protect. That's important because you can spend a lot of money on security. And if you're spending a lot of money and not securing the right entity in your network or in your environment, then you're wasting a lot of money. So you want to focus your money and the controls on the areas and the entities that you're trying to protect. And within a web store, I reckon that there's at least 3 areas, maybe more, but I boiled it down to 3 here, that you really need to put security measures in to protect. The first thing is the customer data. First of all, you want to protect the names of your customers for competitive reasons. The other thing is there's a legal requirement to protect any customer sensitive data. And you'll be aware of the data privacy laws in Bermuda, because there has been a session on that as part of this series. I also mentioned it in November in my webinar. However, the Bermuda privacy law is called PIPA, and there's a slide next to talk about that just a little bit. And there are also laws of other countries which you should be aware of. And so I'll give you an example. If you have a web store in Bermuda and you're selling widgets, you really ultimately want to try to sell those internationally. And your market, you want to broaden your market beyond the sort of boundaries of Bermuda. If you are selling, let's say, to a European cardholder or European customer, by default, you are actually required to comply with the European Data Protection Act. So you want to be familiar with it. It's just one of the costs, if you like, of what are the requirements of being online and selling. So you just want to be familiar with. They all sort of follow the same theme. So if you're adhering to the Bermuda privacy legislation, typically you will be abiding by the European GDPR as well. But the other data you want to make sure you protect is your inventory data. So again, you wouldn't want your inventory data to be sort of on the front page of the Royal Gazette in terms of what you paid for your inventory to your vendors and how you've priced it to your customers. That's all sensitive data to yourself. So you want to make sure that that is protected. And you also want to make sure that any other financial data within the system is protected. And you'd have to decide what that is because it's your site, but you want to be sure that when you're looking at a vendor, you want to understand how they protect that data. And typically, the ultimate level of protection is encryption. You want to try as best you can, work with the vendor, they probably will provide it, is you want to encrypt all of that data whilst it's being stored on a server, or in addition to, I should say, when it's in transit. So you'll be familiar with the HTTPS prefix on a URL on a browser. That indicates that any data that's being transmitted during that session is encrypted. So it's a good, it's an essential security feature these days. So just a little bit about the Bermuda Personal Information Protection Act, and it's abbreviated called PIPA. It governs how sensitive data on a person is used and handled. It defines what is considered sensitive personal information. So I won't go through the whole list there. You can read it. But what you basically want to do in your web store is collect as little of that information as possible. And when you go through the list, you can see that most of that information is 100% not necessary for selling product to a customer. So that's something you need to decide, and you want to minimize the amount of data that you are storing. Any business storing or processing sensitive personal data will have to abide by the Act once it comes into force later this year. So the legislation and law was approved several years ago. However, there's some guidance that's being developed, and it should be out before the end of this year, therefore making the Act effective. And one place to start, and if you're starting a new store, then you probably don't have to go through a data inventory process, only to understand what data that software provider allows you to collect. But you want to start by carrying a data inventory system to determine what type of personal data you are storing and review the processes around collection and maintenance. Now, I'm not going to go into the privacy legislation any more than that, because I said there was a session on that already, but just be sure that you're aware of it, and you can read up on it in your own time. And then the final piece to securing your web store is the payment process. So obviously, for the most part, in order to take payment for any goods you're selling in your web store, you're probably going to be taking a credit card. And if you do, or credit or debit card. And no matter what you do in terms of cards, their card numbers and other card data are considered sensitive data, requiring appropriate security and handling at all times. And I mentioned encryption. If you're using a shopping cart application, many of them use a hosted payment page. So by a hosted payment page, what I mean is that they will refer the browser, redirect the browser of the customer to a page which is hosted by the payment gateway. So First Atlantic Commerce has a hosted payment page solution. By doing so, they impose upon the payment gateway the responsibility for securing the card data. The software provider or service provider doesn't have any access to the card data, neither do you as the merchant. That is the most ideal solution and ideal situation for you to be in, that you never have access to it. And just a reminder that the CVV2 and CVC2, that's a technical term, the card business, but it's the 3 digits on the back of the card. That must never be stored. Most shopping cart vendors, if not all, will know this, so they won't store it, but it's just something for you to be aware of. And then the other aspect to securing card data, but also securing your website, really, and the payment process, is to minimize or reduce your liability as the merchant in terms of authenticating the cardholder. And what I mean by that is you want to be sure that the person entering in the card data and purchasing goods is actually the card holder. And there is a method to do that, a process that the card associations have implemented and deployed called 3DS. It's 3-dimensional security. There's a version 1 that's been around for over 20 years, and they've recently, in the last few years, released version 2. I won't go into a huge amount of detail on this because it's a very complicated process, but just so that you know, it's a way of authenticating the cardholder, and it's the card issuer at the time of the transaction will use certain data points to perform a risk analysis to ascertain whether it is actually the cardholder doing the transaction or it isn't. And then you as a cardholder may be familiar with the process, because when you try to purchase something online, you may be required to put in a PIN or respond to a text message saying that it's you doing the transaction. That is typically the 3D Secure process. Anyway, enough on 3D Secure, but what it does for you as a merchant, it reduces your liability if in the event a fraudulent person gets a hold of a card and purchases goods from you. It's just something to be aware of. The other thing I would mention right now is that in Bermuda, the banks are not currently using 3DS2 for merchants. However, they are looking to do so. So sometime this year, I would anticipate they will start to use 3DS2. And then the other thing was, I mentioned on the previous page, is just making sure that you're using SSL encryption for all data transmission. So that's the HTTPS prefix to the URL. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague. Oops, sorry, I apologize. I have one more slide. In terms of fraud mitigation, so continuing on that line, one of the ways of minimizing your risk as well, it doesn't eliminate risk completely, you never eliminate risk. However, it is requiring that customers sign up to your service with an account. So people who want to commit fraud typically won't want to go through the process of setting up an account on a merchant store. So adding that as a feature on the store is very helpful to reducing the risk of fraud. The other thing is you may want to consider using a fraud management service. Most gateways will offer it, we do, and it will help further evaluate. What a fraud management service does is at the transaction time, it will look at many data points of the transaction. So for instance, it will look at where the PC workstation is that the cardholder is using the IP address. We'll look at the location of the cardholder, where the card is issued versus where the transaction is being conducted from, where the browser is located. And it uses the email address as a data point. It uses numerous data points to determine whether it's actually the cardholder doing the transaction or not. And they will give you a response or some sort of feedback real time during the transaction process for you to make a decision, for your application, I should say, to make a decision sort of real time. And then an older version of sort of fraud mitigation is sort of the address verification service. It's used for Bermuda addresses and North American cardholder addresses. It's used by most payment gateways. It's helpful on its own. It's not, it's not particularly useful. It's better to use with other features. But the point is, it is a service that is used. So now I'll just turn it over to my colleague Tricia, who will talk you through, which is a typical question that comes up in terms of where do I get started. So Tricia, over to you.
Right. And so this is sort of from our perspective at First Atlantic Commerce, how to get started. But obviously, other gateways would have other processes. But the first thing you need to do is get a merchant account. In Bermuda, that you can apply for a merchant account with any of the three banks, HSBC, Clarion, or Butterfield. So a merchant account is different than a business account, and a lot of people get this confused. They come to us with a business account and want to get started. It's also an online merchant account is different than a POS merchant account. So you need to go to the bank and make sure you're applying for online or e-commerce merchant account. And so in order to do that, you'll need to provide the bank with certain documentation to fulfill their KYC requirements and due diligence. And then once you're approved by the bank, you would come back to us, and that's where we would, after going through some commercials on our side, we would have you integrate to our platform. So the process on our side would be you would fill out a basic form with information, and then we'd get you to sign our contract. This is from an FAC perspective, of course. And then we introduce you to our support team to provide you with a test account. If the merchant is using existing shopping cart, it's like we have several vendors that have built plugins for various popular shopping carts that ranges from Magento, Shopify, Wix, WooCommerce, and many more. So if you're using one of those plugins from our third-party vendors, the integration is going to go much faster and quicker because you're using that plugin. Otherwise, you need to do a custom integration to our platform, or your vendor, whoever you're using, will need to do a custom integration to our platform. Once you get your test account, you do your testing, and then once we see the full testing on our staging environment, we will send you the production or live details, so you can test on the production account. That usually takes about a week. It depends on your resources. And then our support team will do what we call an end-to-end test on our side. If all goes well, they will, of course, confirm settlement with the bank to make sure the funds are going to the account that is yours. And then on our side, we'll make sure your website is compliant with the card association requirements. That means things like a privacy policy and terms and conditions, delivery policies, refund policies. They all need to be on your site in order to comply with Visa and MasterCard. And once that's all done, then you'd be cleared for live processing. So that's sort of the process, in a nutshell. It's fairly straightforward, simple. We have integration guides that are available on our website that you can check out. And really, it's just the main thing is getting your merchant account at the bank. That's what takes a lot of time in our experience. And it's partly because they need quite a bit of documentation. It's not hard. It just needs you just need to make sure you give them all the documentation from the outset so that the process can go fast. And then once that merchant account has been established, we move on our side, and that can go quite quickly depending on your resources. So with that, I think that's it for our presentation. If you have any questions, please let us know. Whether that's to do with a business side or cybersecurity or integration, we're happy to answer any questions you might have.
The only thing I would add to Trisha's comments is that it's helpful if you have an IT person helping you with the process.
Yeah.
There are some technical aspects.
Yes.
Yeah, there are some technical aspects to the process, so it's helpful to have an IT person working with you.
Yeah. So when you use a plugin, it's we find that most business owners can do it on their own, but certainly if it's a custom integration, you absolutely need a developer. Having said that, even with the plugins, there's often some confusion, and it can take a lot longer if you don't hire someone or have an IT person on hand.
Right. So as Trisha mentioned, we're on to questions now. So welcome any questions that you have today. There's also the chat line I'm monitoring. I'm just answering one question. Trisha actually works for First Atlantic Commerce along with myself. Are there any other questions today from anyone on the call, on the webinar?
Hopefully that means we've answered all of your questions already.
Yeah. Hopefully. Okay. Well, there being no questions, I just want to thank you once again for joining us today. And have a good day.
Thank you so much.
Take care.
Okay, take care. Bye-bye.